So during the late 90s and the early part of the 2000s, I really started exploring this idea of the way that machine learning and behaviour could connect. And in understanding how machine learning and behaviour connected, I was starting to look at lots of structures made out of artificial neurons. In other words, devices that computed in a very rough approximation of what the neurons inside our brains do. Now, as I started to construct these different structures and get them to learn to do different things and behave in different ways, the networks got more and more complex. And at that time, I met up with Professor Janet Wiles, also at the University of Queensland, who's a cognitive scientist, profound cognitive scientist. And she said, you know, you're trying to get robots that navigate. And one of the key brain structures that helps rats to navigate is the hippocampus. And in fact, the hippocampus has got some of the best computational models of any part of the brain. Have you ever thought about using a computational model of a hippocampus to make your robot work? What a great idea, Janet. And so with a student called Brett Browning, we got some initial results on what the computational model of a hippocampus might look like and got that to work in some of our soccer robots, actually, initially, in terms of the way that the robots navigated. And on the back of that work, we then applied for my first research council funding. And I was very lucky to get it. They gave me just 1 year's funding just to explore this idea a little bit further. And that was enough for me to recruit a student called Michael Milford. And Michael Milford and David Prasser was the other student, came on board to start looking at, well, let's really try and make some robots that understand the world, not just react to the world, but actually retain an understanding of the layout of the world, because that's what rats do. But let's do it on a completely different premise. Let's do it on the premise that we're retaining the sequence of images that helps us recall how to get to a place, rather than building some kind of geometric map. And that's how the notion of RAT-SLAM was born. So SLAM is the problem of simultaneous localization and mapping, S-L-A-M, SLAM. And SLAM as a field is really about doing geometric optimization. Make lots of measurements with lasers and ultrasound and everything, get all that geometric information and fuse it. RAT-SLAM took all that geometric optimization and threw it away and said, well, a lot of the time you can know where you are just by looking at something. I can show you some key images, and you'll know exactly where you are, right? So, if you saw a key image, like the one behind me, you'd know you're in my kitchen, right? And so can't we use these visual place representations to get us from one place to another? Because that seems to be what the rats do. They're not building, there's no evidence inside a rat brain that there's a whole bunch of geometric optimization going on. Instead, there seems to be this pipeline inside the rat brain that's taking these images and putting them into sequences that, unravel, so that if you do get two places that look the same, you know where you were before, you know where the next one is, and you can disambiguate those kind of places. We started out doing this work with some quite precise, what we thought were reasonably precise models of hippocampus, and then started to learn more and more about what's actually involved inside a brain. And that work went off on one angle, and on the other side we said, well, we're getting some amazing engineering results, and so we took those on a different journey again. And those were kind of the two paths that I travelled over the next decade or so. Yeah, computational neuroscience was certainly warming up as a field. There was a lot of good stuff going on. So based on the success that we'd had with RAT-SLAM, I think it was 2005, we became involved with the Thinking Systems project. And the Thinking Systems project was a special research initiative for bringing together engineers, mathematicians, neuroscientists to really understand the computational models of thinking. You know, what does thinking look like? How do we compute thinking? This whole idea of intelligence, but perhaps exploring it in a much deeper and a much more cross-disciplinary fashion than had been done in the past. So for the first time, I wasn't just reading neuroscience papers and trying to make them in a robot. I was talking to neuroscientists and trying to understand what the hell they were talking about, because what they were talking about sounded very different to what I read in the papers. And that project probably took us 2 years to even understand each other, because they didn't understand what I was talking about when I talked about navigation. But as we started to understand what each other meant, we were joining together the ideas of neuroscience, like wet neuroscience, computational neuroscience, and robotics. And that's when we started to get some pretty amazing results. In 2007, as we'd been working through the Thinking Systems project, we were really bringing this engineering strand of the RATSLAM work to a head. And we wanted to test it. We couldn't get it to break. It worked. We kept doing harder and harder things to it. We did a room, then we did a whole office set, and then we did a whole floor of a building, and it was working. And without a mode of failure, you can't really see what the weaknesses are. So the challenge then that Michael, who was my postdoc then at this stage, undertook was to strap a laptop to the roof of his car, a Mazda 323, and drive around the suburb of St Lucia, recording the video as it came into the camera on his laptop. And so we drove this path through every street in St Lucia, looping around, going backwards, just recording the video stream. Then we played that video stream through the RATSLAM algorithm. So the RATSLAM algorithm, taking this sequence of images and places that it recognises. And over the 2 hours or so of driving around this suburb, the sun's changing, clouds are going up and down, shadows, there's traffic, there's different people. Would the algorithm be able to recognise that it got back to the same place, even though it looked different in subtle ways, based on the fact that there were sequences of images that allowed you to pull the street together? And so Michael produced this stunning video that showed what was going on inside the RATSLAM brain. It came up with a visualization we called the experience map. And the map is beautiful. You can just see as the loops start to close. Initially, the map is malformed, and then it gets better and better and better and better. And you can end up being able to overlay it on a Google Maps image of the suburb and just show how the RATSLAM algorithm could take this sequence of images and put it into a spatial representation that enabled you to work out how to get from one place to another. This was the breakthrough result. When we had this result and the beautiful video that Michael had, not to mention all the huge amounts of legwork that nearly killed him to get that done, this was the video that people saw and went, actually, there's something in this. There really is something in this. And I think that was the point that the whole field of visual place recognition really started to take off.